Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today, I'm going to be taking up more of your questions in another segment of Ask Judy. If you do enjoy these, please do hit like and subscribe. I have a question here from Diane Will, who said, I was watching The Conflict, and in the opening scene, the family is driving in the truck. John mentioned something about school starting back soon, so I'm assuming it's toward the end of summer. I enjoyed Grandpa's sing-along with all the children in the back of the truck. That seemed ad-libbed by Will, was it? That I'm not really sure. I don't remember. It could have been in the script that it said they're singing in the back of the truck, or it could have been the director's decision in the moment to let's have something going on back there. So they chose a couple of songs that we would sing that would have been in the public domain, so wouldn't have caused any trouble. We sang On Top of Old Smoky, and we sang Clementine. So, and Will at times was, yes, sort of leading us with what the next line was. So I think it was meant to seem very impromptu, but may not entirely have been. Then you continued on. At one point, John Boy stands up and says something to John through the window. Was that scene filmed while they were actually driving? Yes, in looking at that opening sequence driving along the road, it does appear to all be live shot. So as opposed to looking like a process shot, you can actually see us driving down the road. You can see us all in the back of the truck. They would have had either an actual camera truck rigged up with the camera to follow and also to lead the truck when you can see into the front window and see John and Olivia and Grandma sitting in there talking. So they don't go as all that fast. So if you're concerned about us all being back there sitting on the side of the truck, we weren't going very fast. So we were all making sure everybody was safe. Then you said it seemed like a warm day, but when they go to see Martha Corinne the next day, most everyone is wearing a coat or a jacket. I was wondering if that scene was filmed out of order and jackets and sweaters were a necessity because in later scenes, no one is wearing a jacket and Wade even has his sleeves rolled up when he and John Boy are in the field. So, yeah, it is like the next day or something when we go up to see Martha Corinne and the family up there on the mountain. And it could be that we were meant to be arriving fairly early in the day. And as the day went on and it warmed up, people pulled their jackets off and things like that. And of course, John Boy ends up staying up there for a few days. And therefore, it would make sense that sometimes, in particular, if you're out working, oftentimes you get warmed up. So I think that may have been the thought on all of that with the weather and the jackets on and off. And then you said, I am assuming most of the episode was filmed in Fraser Park. All those things kind of up on the mountain, yes, and driving along those roads, things like that. So they did do, it might have only been one day actually in Fraser Park. I remember when I talked to Ralph Sinensky, who directed the episode, he talked about sort of negotiating, getting time in Fraser Park in exchange for shooting the entire episode faster, and that he had to work really fast up there to get everything that we needed. So I think it might have all been done in one day, maybe 2 days, but I don't really remember at the time. But Ralph Sinensky's blog, he talks in great detail about all the episodes he directed. So if you go to sinensky.com and look up the Waltons, The Conflict, you can look at all of his notes about that. Or perhaps one of the episodes I did on my YouTube here with Ralph Sinensky, where we talked about various different episodes and the filming. He also talks about it. So hope that helps. Then, was there an actual cabin in the park that was used for the house, or was that a temporary structure built by the crew? Likely a temporary structure built by the crew, and probably interiors were done on the soundstage back at the studio, which is why we didn't need to be in Fraser Park for as long. Then, an inconsistency I noticed was that in this episode, Martha Corinne says that the road was going to come around the curve and right through her house, but in the pony cart, when John Boy takes her back to her home place, there's no highway running through where the cabin supposedly was. Well, that's a good point. And obviously they couldn't suddenly have a road there. And when they did go back up there, and like the old homestead, when we saw that sometimes up on the mountain, like in the Love Story, that was something that it was a structure that was put together for the filming of that and then removed by our art department and our set construction department. Then I would also love to hear you talk about how you felt about the pigs in the scene when you were trapped on the log with Aaron and Elizabeth. I had a pet pig growing up, so I always find that scene comical. I remember when that was happening that I did question it because I thought Mary Ellen, being as fearless as she appears to be at times, that she would not be one to be squealing and running up a tree to get away from pigs. And I did ask the director, and he actually brought in the producer who was on set and asked him to his opinion on it. And the producer, I guess, came and talked with me, and Ralph said that, that he turned it over to the producer, and then I arrived on set and shot the film as instructed. So sometimes you can ask those questions and try and fight a little bit for what you think is right for your character. But if you get overruled, you get overruled. And you just do your best to make it seem as realistic as possible. But I know I did feel kind of silly doing it, but tried to make it believable. So I hope it seemed believable at the time. This question is from AJ Fisher Design. Judy, I finally found season 8 DVDs at the thrift store and watched The Wager yesterday. It's an exciting episode. Yeah, I sure had a lot of fun filming it. I noticed that at the end there was a winner's board and Ed Graves' name is on there. And Ed Graves was our art director. And it said, I wonder if some of the other names might be references to Waltons production folks. Thanks. So I took a look at The Wager, and on that board, the team that has Ed Graves' name on, his partner theoretically in the horse race, is listed as Ernie Wallengren. Ernie was our story editor at the time and was also the son of Claire Whitaker, who was also a story editor on the show. And she and her husband, Rod Peterson, wrote a number of main key episodes over the course of the seasons. But then I also remembered that in the episode The Hero, when there is sort of a day honoring the local veterans that died in the war and things like that, as the ceremony's happening and they're walking through sort of the local graveyard, and a number of those grave markers have names on them. And I don't know if all of them had some sort of an inside meaning, but I didn't recognize all the names. But I did recognize Earl Hamner's name on one of the grave markers, as well as Harry Harris, obviously one of our directors who did a number of episodes. Lawrence Dobkin, so Larry Dobkin, who directed a number of episodes and also worked as an actor as Professor Goat at Boatwright University. Ralph Farron is listed. He was one of our assistant directors, one of our first assistant directors. And there was also a point where we see the name Eugene Fowler, and I believe that was Gene Fowler, who was one of our editors. Some of the other names very well may have had some significance that I wasn't aware of. They may have been crew that I didn't know, or just that I am sadly forgetting. Or they could have been production people that I didn't interact with, so didn't know their names. This next question is from Lucky, who said, maybe this has been mentioned before, but I'm not sure. Yesterday I was watching John Ritter's first episode, and that would be The Sinner. He arrived at the house, stepped out of the car, and John was out front with the children. He introduced Reverend Fordwick to each. When he got to Ben's introduction, John introduced him as Eric. Eric's expression says it all. I have seen this episode over the years countless times, and this is the first time I noticed this. So I looked back at that, and you'll see this little sequence here.
This is my brood here. It's John Boy and Jason, Jim Bob. And there's Aaron, Mary Ellen, Ben.
When John introduces the children, and he mentions John Boy, Jason, and Jim Bob, and then as there is a close-up of the other Reverend, he says Aaron, and then it comes to a close-up and you see, and he says Mary Ellen and Ben, and he does say Ben. So it could be that when he said Aaron and you weren't seeing Aaron's face there, that you might have thought that was Eric rather than Aaron. So perhaps just something that you didn't hear quite quite correctly, but he does indeed say Ben, as you see here. And then second question, in the opening credits, the actors are identified by their real names, but with Will Geer, it is his name and character name, and Will Geer as the grandfather. Why the dedication? I believe that was sort of an extra little focus on Will because he was given last billing. You had an actor like Will who had quite a career, and he wasn't getting more and sequentially. It was Richard Thomas, then it was Ralph Waite and Michael Learned, who sort of alternated in terms of which one was first. So they were giving them sort of equal secondary billing, and then Ellen and Will. So to just give Will, I think, a little extra sort of acknowledgement by saying as the grandfather, it sort of brought some extra attention to him and helped him stand out. Sometimes you'll see with movies and introducing or special guest star, blah, blah, blah. And so sometimes just doing that, it makes a character, an actor stand out. So it's a little extra sort of perk and acknowledgement there. This question is from Susan Lily Doreen, who said, on average, how long would it take them to put a script together for each episode? And in television, who puts the final approval on the script? Michael McGreevy chatted a bit about that when he and I talked recently. So you can maybe try and look back on one of those, which might give you more details from his perspective as a writer, and also that his father, John McGreevy, wrote many episodes of the Waltons. But basically, it depends on the writer. Some writers are very fast, and in television, sometimes you have to be rather fast. So it could be, I would say, less than a month to write the script, and very likely it could be, a couple of weeks, and you would turn it in. You would have a session with the story editor or Earl Hamner as the sort of senior person over scripts for the Waltons. And then you'd get notes from the story editor, and you would go back and do rewrites. So how long that took you would obviously depend on how many notes and how much for a rewrite that involved. In terms of the final approval on the script, that would be likely Earl or the story editor, depending on the situation. Earl was the story editor for the first few seasons and was always there. And sometimes there would be more rewrites that would happen during the course of the filming or during pre-production, and those rarely would go back to the original writer for those rewrites. Those would be done by the story editor or by Earl, usually in that case. And then you said, do they plan out the whole year for what each episode looks like, or for each episode? They might know going in a number of the episodes, but often it would be happening during the course of the season as well. And writers would come in and pitch ideas, and Earl would say yes, no, or yes, write that. And there would be those kinds of conversations. So people would be assigned different scripts. Sometimes it was something they pitched. I think there were occasions perhaps when Earl had something he wanted to have done and maybe had a conversation with a writer, and that writer then took that on to write, or sometimes Earl wrote them. But I know there were some times when we'd get the whole breakdown for the season, there might be some that were to be determined, in terms of the script. But usually there was at least some sort of title. So how many of those were actually written yet, or just assigned, and then knowing that they would be submitted and ready. And maybe some writers took longer. So if they were assigned something that wasn't going to happen for months, they had more time if they wanted to or needed it. But probably successful writers that did a lot of work had to get them done pretty quickly. And then you said, I was just curious as to how long on average it took the writer to put the idea and the script together and the story together. So again, depended on how easily it came together. So thank you. Have a beautiful day. Thank you very much for your questions. And sort of continuing in that theme, Lisa Dieter Burns said this. They really get to the heart of each person you have as a guest. I'm curious, maybe you've already covered and asked Judy about the writing process for a Waltons episode. For example, did the network contract with specific writers in advance of a season, or was it more on a submission basis open to many? The way that the network would sometimes weigh in was that they would have a list of approved writers. So it might not be that you could just bring in a whole bunch of new writers, that if you were looking to put together things, you see a lot of the same names on different TV shows of the era. And I think that was because they knew that those were dependable writers who had a track record of getting scripts done, getting good scripts done. So, but there were certainly people who came in and wrote for us, like Michael McGreevy, John McGreevy's son, who wrote 4 episodes of The Waltons. And, he said he just pitched to Earl. So whether Earl then had to get the approval from the network about John writing a script, or whether that was sort of left in Earl's hands, I'm not sure. But the network for our show at that time did not hire the writers. Our company did. And then you said, how far in advance was an episode story purchased, and about how long did the critiquing and updating and rewriting take? As I mentioned with the previous question, it really depended on the writer and how good the first draft was, basically. And like actors learning lines, each actor has a different amount of time it takes them to learn lines. And same thing with writers. I've worked with writers who were really, really slow writing, and others that could just whip something off really fast. And it was good, or it was good enough to then get into the rewrite phase pretty quickly. And then who would be involved? That the rewriting would be the Earl or the story editor working with the writer. And then what was a run-of-the-mill timeline process till it was ready to present on script. So again, I think it depends on how early in the season you got the assignment and you knew you were going to be writing it. So, but I think people typically had, at least a month, maybe a couple months, maybe longer if they knew before the season started. So I hope that helped. Thank you for joining me for this segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons Ask Judy. I'll see you next time for more episodes, more questions, and more special guests. Thanks for watching.